We're live.
Like live?
Live.
Oh, okay. Well, hello. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Today I will be working or showing you guys or teaching, whatever you want to call it. We'll be going through a course today called Full Stack Deployment from Containers to Production. The objective of this goal or of this course is really to gain real-world full stack deployment experience. And I want to take this from a kind of a different perspective, which is not just like, hey, let's just build something and take away what you can from that one thing that you built. This course is more focused on going through the evolution of infrastructure and going through the evolution of an application, right? So we're actually going to be, seeing infrastructure grow and change from the startup phase, the growth phase, the scale stages, and all of that. So that's really what I want you to gain or take away from this course, is not just to be able to build an application, but actually understand why we built or deployed the application the way that we did. So quickly, I'll give you an introduction to myself if you don't know me. Hello, my name is Eric Reinert, also known as Black Glasses on the internet. I'm a senior software engineer. I'm a content creator. I enjoy making diagrams and flowcharts, and I'm a habitual problem solver. It's one of my favorite things to do, which is a big reason why I am in the career I am today. I have a decent amount of work experience. I've been in the game for a little while. Interestingly, about my past, I've kind of delved in multiple what's the word I'm looking for? Positions. I started out as a front-end engineer. I did that for about 2.5 years. I worked with front-end before React was even a thing, PHP days, good old PHP days. And then I kind of realized that I hated that. And so I ended up moving from front-end and learning kind of that, experience and what I gained from it to back-end engineering, where I then started working on back-ends and learning things like TypeScript and Go, learning how to build more like communication between systems and stuff like that. And then I kind of followed that into full stack, and I did that for a while as well. I worked at a startup where I was kind of like lead POC on a lot of the things that we were trying to do to get them out. And then again, I kind of had, if you notice, a little bit of a pattern here of almost every 2.5 years I get bored and then I go do something else. And so that's what I was doing and this is kind of why I like talking about this really quickly is I don't think any of us have like deterministic paths in this career. Someday you might want to be a front-end engineer, someday you might want to do back-end, you might want to do other things. And so that was a big reason or a big part of why I kept jumping so much was because I kept following that curiosity, which led me to really what I do now, which is DevOps and platform engineering. I focus very heavily on solving business problems, solving them at scale, and solving developer problems as well, which is something I, again, throughout the years of working in multiple areas, I kind of learned and got to grow and understand what people hate, because I hated a lot of that stuff too. So yeah, just a note about if you're ever wondering about should I get into DevOps or anything like that, this is kind of how I got into it. So I do build things on the internet. As I said before, I am a content creator. I stream on Twitch. I have a YouTube channel called the Alta 4 Stream. I'm also, this used to be Twitter. I guess now it's X. I'm on X, as well as I have an engineering blog as well. So if you want to check out any of the stuff that I've done, you're more than welcome to check out those links. I do have some existing courses as well. One thing to note about this course, which is actually pretty cool, is if you are following the learning paths on Front-End Masters, Jem Young has a systems course that he recently did, I believe.
Full stack for
full stack.
front-end
Sorry,
engineers.
What is it?
Full stack for front-end engineers.
That's right. Yeah,
it's the basic of sysadmin.
That's right, yeah. So if you guys are, sysadmins, just kind of wondering if you should get into, this field or this line of work, he has a great course. And then this course is kind of like a follow-up to that. So if you guys are, wanting something that can kind of get you started and then kind of delve deeper into it, Jem's course is definitely a good one to check out. Cool. Okay, so yeah, outside of that, I do have 3 of my own courses that are on the platform. I, try and stay in my own world a little bit, but I do like to, branch out as much as I can. I have Introduction to DevOps for Developers, Enterprise Cloud Infrastructure, and Introduction to Backend Architectures. If you're curious about the courses, basically, Introduction to DevOps for Developers is really focused on devs who want to get into DevOps. You've never built pipelines before, you've never learned how to automate things or anything like that. It's a great course to get started with. Can help with some of this stuff we do today. Enterprise Cloud Infrastructure, this one's really focused on, okay, I'm at a company now, I'm managing tons of teams. How do I go to scale? This is, I would say, a little bit beyond the course that we're doing today, but you can kind of see how we get to there after this course. And then Introduction to Backend Architectures. So if you've ever been curious about, how do I build backends? How do I make sure that they're communicating properly? How do I scale them properly? All of that kind of stuff. Introduction to Backend Architectures is a pretty good one to check out too. And again, these all really kind of relate to each other. So if you're interested, be sure to check them out. So yeah, let's get into the course introduction. I wanted to use this GIF because I felt like it was pretty appropriate. We're going to be doing a lot today. So, strap in. I hope you guys are excited. This course is a heavy workshop course. It really is focused on being hands-on. So yeah. We have a few goals in this course. The first is to really manage growing infrastructure, as I said before. I don't want you to just build one thing. I want you to build something and then see it change and why we change it and how it changes and the changes that we decide to make. And then also learn to when to make changes, right? I'm sure some of you guys have been at companies where people have made changes and then you've been like, this is the worst time to make this change. Why are we doing this right now, right? Where the field or, the role that we play when we're talking about managing infrastructure, you're the janitor, but also simultaneously the architect. People live in that house, and the more you change that house, the more they're going to be annoyed. And the worst thing you can do as a DevOps engineer or platform engineer or just impacting developers' lives is change things with, underneath their feet and then expect them to be happy. They're normally not. So, when you're making big changes, it's important to know when you're making those changes, why you're making those changes, because, you fuel the productivity of the company. Balancing pros and cons of solutions. This is also really important. Again, when we're talking about building a house, do we want to build a mansion? Do we need to build an apartment? Do we need a mansion for one person, right? Things like that. And then again, improve hands-on experience. I want you guys to really get your hands, in there and, start understanding, or start getting more comfortable with the tools. There are a few prerequisites for this course, but they're also really basic. I wouldn't be too stressed about any of these prereqs. They're just really checklists, really. So if you have a little bit of a fundamental, knowledge of Docker, that's fine. I really only expect you to have ran the CLI and maybe built one container image. I don't expect you to, know what linking is and volumes and all, none of that, but, just a good understanding why you're using it and, having maybe ran a Docker file or two. Experience using Git and GitHub, right? We're going to be working with source control. We're going to be using GitHub as where all of that source control goes, as well as all of our automation. So GitHub and Git kind of are tied together on this one. A basic understanding of Amazon, and when I say basic, I mean very basic. I do not expect you to be some cloud architect. I do not expect you to know all of the resources in Amazon, and if you do, that's amazing. I don't. But yeah, just a basic understanding of, maybe used it once or twice, set up the CLI, stuff like that. Command line and scripting experience, again, very simple. Use the command line, know that you've used it, having, messed around with it a little bit. And same thing with scripting. There's only one real script in the entire course, but it's a little bit of a doozy, so I'd like to make sure that you at least understand it. AWS account, this is really just for the actual course itself, something that you can provision resources in. I do want to be clear, we will be provisioning things that cost money. Sorry, them's the ways of cloud. So we will be. The course is really focused on making sure that you can at least delete everything. It's very, very. Everything's on the free tier, so don't worry about breaking your wallet or anything like that. We're not provisioning 32 core instances or anything. But yeah, just an AWS account. Make sure that you can create stuff and all of that. Also a GCP account. We're only really using it just for the credential side, but being able to log in and access a project. And then again, Supabase as well with a free plan. You might be like, why are we using Amazon and Supabase? Don't worry, we'll get into it later. But yeah, those are really all of the things that you need. Sorry, one second. Okay, cool. So let's talk about the course structure because it is definitely, yeah, what's up?
Little side note, when you got your coffee cup.
Sorry, yep.
You can take a drink, but yeah.
Okay.
And just another reminder about tapping and rubbing.
Sorry.
It's
Yep.
just a reminder.
Okay, no worries. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the course structure. So this course is separated into phases, as I said before. Each phase focuses on unique scenarios, right? Each phase is on implementing unique solutions for that phase, and then each phase provides valuable takeaways that we can learn from. When you're making changes like this and you're deploying things, you want to learn from them. I'm sure we've also been in scenarios where you've had the same infrastructure for 10 years. Nobody's asked why we should change it, and that's how it is. That's great, but have at least a reason why, have good takeaways and say okay, well, this is why we're doing it. So, each phase will provide us with at least some value, hopefully. So again, the three phases that we're going to be going into are the startup phase, the growth phase, and then the scale phase. So the startup phase is really just the tried and true, just get it working. Right? That's the whole point of the startup phase, and what we're going to do and what we're going to focus on is just plain and simple, just get it working. I want to, I just want to get my app online. I just want to get it running in production. I just want to make sure that it can easily be accessible. I don't want to worry about hosting things or, resources or cloud or any of that. Just get it working, right? The growth phase, we got to go fast, right? Okay, now it's working, great, fantastic. We got to keep pushing code. We got to keep making changes. We got to keep delivering features, right? This is normally the next part of the evolution of an application, hopefully, right? You make it, you get it online, and then after you get it online, you start, dealing with growth and how to handle that. And then again, the last phase, scale phase, is really plan for the future. Normally, when you start dealing with scale, you're starting to think about how much traffic will we have a year from now? How much traffic are we dealing with between now and a year from now? Where are we going to be as a company, right? All of these kind of things taken into consideration. So I do have links online for all of the materials. So if you need them, you can access them. The main link that you will need is just github.com, Alta4LLC, FEMFD service. That's the main root repo. So if you guys want to go ahead and pull that up now, feel free. I'll give you a second while I drink my coffee. Each phase in this course is set up into its own branch. Now we're going to start with the main branch. So we're just going to start with the default main branch. But if you want to, skip ahead and look really quickly at the other branches to see the final results of what we're going to be doing, you're more than welcome to. Or if after the course later on you want to go back and reference it, you're more than welcome to as well. And again, like I said, each stage has its own branch that I've been maintaining for this. Nice. 1 minute till my... Okay. All good? Everybody got it up? Cool. Awesome. Okay. And then I will be working in a branch called Workshop. So I... just a quick thing about this workshop. As we grow in complexity, there will be more things to manage. And so what I simply mean by that is that it may not be easy for you to word and line by line rewrite a 500 line Terraform file. And so in that case, if we want, or if you want to, I'll just push up the code. You can then copy it into your project, and then we can keep moving. But that's what that branch will mostly be used for. Cool. Okay, so we have now done the introduction of the course. Nailed it too, 30 minutes, perfect, or 15 minutes, perfect, awesome. All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump into our first phase. Before we do, though, does anyone have any questions about any of what I've already gone over, about what we're going to be doing, anything like that? Cool, okay, awesome. All right, so startup phase, just get it working. If you've ever worked at a startup company before, if you've ever, been on a project that's been, growing or starting to be developed as an application, you've probably heard this quite a bit. Just get it working. You've probably heard it from your manager too. This is normally a phase that is heavily focused around, we need to get things out the door. Right, the highest priority right now is users, features, being able to get more people onto the application. And that's really like when we talk about like a business priority, that's all business is caring about. Something to note about DevOps and platform, especially as you move up higher in it, it will become more and more about business and less about technology. Because a lot of it eventually ends up becoming, okay, well, I want to convince you why we should make these changes and why we should, actually move from this platform to this platform. And so in this phase, normally, you'll deal with the hardest pushback. Normally, people will be like, no, I don't care about any of this. Just get it run. Just get it working. So our phase scenario, each phase, like I said, has a scenario. The phase scenario here is that we have source code managed by a development team. We didn't write this source code. We don't really have any understanding of it, right? Like there's, we know that there takes some environment variables, and we know that if we run the binary, it should work, right? But that's really about as far as we're going with the source code itself. We're not going to really be doing any actual source code changes or anything like that. And this is like pretty common in a DevOps, platform deployment scenario. You don't really know, you might not have like a deep knowledge of the actual source code itself, but you are going to be maintaining the infrastructure around it. So that's the mindset I want you to be in. We need the quickest deployment with minimal effort required, right? So again, the goal here should be, I don't want to have to hire another person to get this out the door. I want to be able to do it myself. I want to be able to, get this up and running pretty easily. We're looking for the biggest wins with minimal required setup. So again, going back to that whole minimal effort, we want to just get it working. We want it to be online, set up and running. I don't want to have to put in a ton of effort to do that. And then the last thing is we are, we're learning about what needs to be maintained. None of you know what we're deploying. I do, but in this scenario, I wouldn't either, right? So this would be also a learning part as well. So you can't expect in your first phase to be optimizing. That's something I want you to take away from this. This is like normally in a startup phase, you're not optimizing. You're focusing on getting the fundamentals down and like, again, just get it working. The goals here are actually very simple. We're going to create a repository to store source code. Each of you are going to do that. We're going to create a database deployment for production, and we're going to create an application production or a deployment for production as well. So really 3 simple things: repo, database deployment, and application deployment. So we are going to take a quick second here. I just want to make sure that everyone at least has this stuff set up. There are some requirements here to make sure that we can all get through this together. The first one is just make sure that you have Docker set up. Make sure that you've got Go installed. Make sure that you've got a GitHub account. Make sure that you've got your GCP account. Make sure that you've got your AWS account and credentials. And then also make sure that you've got a Supabase account. So before I begin, I don't mind taking some time to make sure that everyone has all of that stuff set up. So does anyone need any help with any of that stuff? Yes, you do? Okay. What do you need help with?
The CLI credentials.
Okay, I can show you how to do that really quickly. So I'm going to hop out of this real fast, and then I'm going to log into my AWS. Give me 1 second here. So I assume you've already logged into the Amazon account. Like, do you have your root user? Yeah.
Why don't we deliver this like you're showing, just like you're teaching everyone to do it, because we'll probably make this a lesson.
Sure, I can do that. Yeah.
Just talk to everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So are you at this? Oh, not this. You won't see this. If you don't see this, that's fine.
I was there before. I'm having trouble getting back to it right now.
Okay. I just want to make sure that you can get to this page right here. So if you need to set up an account, make sure that you get to this page first. My costs are up 2%. Oh no. You can log in with your root account as well if you need to.
Yeah, see, I'm not even sure what that means.
Oh, okay.
I've done a try to log in, and
Here,
it's
I'll
using
come-
MFA, and it's sent me an email. It's just not showed up yet.
No worries.
Right, so I'm waiting for this. Usually
Okay.
it's much faster, but
You're
it's not
fine.
here
No
yet.
worries.
I would just leave it. Because who knows how long.
Come on, refresh, do something.
Sounds great.
Like I said, it's usually just shows up.
We see your ear now,
Like autofocus, Eric. Like,
Nice.
Yeah.
the camera. There you go.
Yeah, that's
I'm gonna try it again.
We need more camera as well.
User
so.
email. Sign in here with my password.
You still haven't gotten the email? That's weird. I'm guessing you're logging in. So, can you show me where you logged in? So you logged into. Can you hit cancel for me?
Okay. So like.
Yeah, so you are trying to log into your root account. Okay. And when you do your account. Oh, yeah, you need. Yeah, you set this up with an app. Yeah.
I sure did. There it is.
Nice. And that should get you in. Yeah.
There we go.
Awesome.
So maybe just for like the actual lesson in the course, just kind of be like, start with like
Sure.
log in your AWS root account and make sure you can get to the console. And
Yeah,
then-
yeah.
And then kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so I understand this part is somewhat annoying, a lot because I've done this a lot, which is just simply getting credentials on AWS. If you don't have it or if you've never done it before, that's entirely fine. I don't expect you to. Amazon's annoying and confusing already. Sorry, I'm probably not going to get sponsored for that. But anyways, if you want to create a user or create credentials, the easiest way to do it, and if there's people out there who's like, no, do it this way, this is the easiest way to do it. I'm not telling you it's the most secure way to do it. I'm just telling you the easiest way to do it. Is go ahead and up at the top, type in IAM, and then navigate to the IAM. Do not go to IAM Identity Center. IAM Identity Center is like an entirely separate thing for managing like organizations and stuff. You just want to go to good old IAM. And so that once you're in IAM, you'll notice that like my account ID is up here, all that stuff. If I click on users on the left, you'll notice that I have some users already created. I can go ahead and create a whole new, and you'll actually notice that I have a user for the course here too. You can create a user by just clicking create user. Give it a name of whatever you want. So if you wanted it for the course, you just be FEM FD service. That's the actual like repo. Zoom in a little bit more for you guys. If you wanted to make it so that you could log into this user and actually access the UI, then you would click this. I don't need to worry about that, so we're just going to use it for CLI credentials. Then hit next. This is the part that again people will probably like shun me for, but if you click on attach policies directly, you can then give it existing policies that Amazon kind of has already created for you. But there's one right here that you really want, which is just administrator access. This will make it so that if you open it up, it's just ***. It lets you do everything. So just note that this is a root level access user. But again, for what we're doing, it's fine. Click next, and then click create user down at the bottom right. And so it'll create that user. And then once that user is created, you can go to the user itself. And then there will be a tab here that says security credentials. You just click on that. And then you'll see access keys, use access keys to send programmatic calls. You click create access key. And then it'll give you a list. Again, this is why I don't expect you to know this, because it's already super easy. It'll give you a list of what things you want to click. Just click command line to use it with the command line. Click I understand at the bottom. And then click next. And then click create access key. And so what this is going to do is this is going to create you a access key and a secret access key. This is how Amazon basically authenticates all of its users, and these are long-living keys as well, so they will not expire, which is another thing to note. But if you want to actually use them, the next thing I would recommend doing is just going to Google and typing in AWS CLI creds. There's a little article here called Configuration and Credential File Settings in AWS CLI. And if you scroll down, where is it? Oh, this is the configure approach. Where's the environment variables approach? One second. There we go. Yeah. So when it generated you keys, it generated you an access key and a secret access key, which I'm not going to show for obvious reasons. But you can then export those to your shell by running this command, or by basically copying this and pasting it. Obviously, don't use these credentials because these are the fake ones that they put in their article. But you can replace the values, and then you should be set up with your shell. Were you able to get that set up?
Getting there.
Okay, cool. No worries. Take your time. Let me go ahead and log in. I'll show you guys while we're waiting. I'll show you guys the other approach. So, like I said, Amazon does have the IAM Identity Center. And so if you have that set up, you can actually log in the way I'm doing, which is just making sure that I can log in via my SSO account. And there we go.
Are we gonna use Docker just to build an image or to actually run things?
Oh, we're gonna use Docker. We're gonna use a lot of Docker. No.
Is there going to be a separate course on how to set up this awesome terminal?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. If Mark will let me. Yeah, ricing as they call it.
Yeah.
There you go. You should make a Linux ricing course.
Yeah, with the whole PewDiePie thing going on, that's
Oh my
be
gosh.
popular.
That's funny. Bring him in. Add him to the team. Cool. Okay. So once you've got those credentials added to your shell, if you want to check and make sure that it's working, you can do AWS in your shell, S3, and then LS. So AWS space S3 LS. If you hit enter and you either see nothing or something like this happens, then you are connected. You have authenticated. And again, if you see nothing, that's fine too. If you weren't auth, it would just tell you, hey, you're not authenticated. So cool. Okay, so let's go back to the slides really quickly. did we need to go over anything else? To the Google account? I mean, I would imagine the Google Cloud account was pretty easy to set up. Everybody was good with that. Project created, all that stuff. Cool. Okay. And then yeah, Supabase is pretty straightforward as well. Does everyone have a Supabase account too? All that stuff? Cool. Okay. Awesome. Great. Fantastic. Okay. So before each phase, I'm going to quickly talk about what we're building, why we're building it, and you get to see a fun flow chart because I like flow charts. So in the startup phase, we're going to be focused on building the infrastructure that you see right in front of you. It looks complex, but it's actually very, very simple, right? So the goal of this infrastructure is, as we said before, to just get it working, right? I don't want to worry about managing things. So what are the things that we have to manage? Well, we need to manage an application running, and we need to manage a database that that application connects to, right? Those are the two things that we will have to figure out solutions for. Now, you may immediately go, okay, well, let's build on top of Amazon and use VPCs and da-da-da, but like you don't need any of that, right? Like you can, sure, if you want to become a cloud architect, you can go out and learn that stuff, but you don't really need that. And like when you're in the startup phase of a company or in the startup phase of an application, you've probably heard like, you know, host my WordPress on Kubernetes. Like that's definitely one of those scenarios where it's like, dude, you don't need like, just like put it on a VPS. Again, just simple. Put it on a VPS, have it running, just do whatever you need to just get it online. Now, there's a couple of things that we do want to kind of make decision-wise, right? The first one is do we want to use a VPS or do we want to at least try and be containerized, right? That's kind of probably a decision you'll end up making whenever you start trying to deploy something. And here's what I will say about that. VPSs are great, but in terms of technology and like the things we can do today, they are a little outdated. A VPS, when we mean a VPS, it's just an instance, right? You get a Linux instance, you SSH into it, you set up you set up all the programs you need, you copy the files over to the instance, all that work, and then you run a command, and then boom, there you go. You can do that, and I'm not like trying to say you shouldn't. Like if you want to set up a VPS, go for it. I'm not here to necessarily tell you what to do. But again, I want you to hear me out when I say like there's reason as to why every single one of these components were picked. It wasn't just because I like Amazon products. So for me personally, we are using containers now. We have the day of images, right? I can ship an operating system with Docker, right? I can at least ship a image of that VPS basically with a Docker image, right? And so one of the decisions that were made in the startup phase was to say, okay, we're going to do containers. Like we're going to, at least out the gate, we're going to do containers to make it so that we can at least also move in the future, right? Because we know we're going to eventually probably want to move to bigger orchestrators and stuff like that. So why not make this decision now, right, at the startup phase, and then let that grow as the organization or as the project goes. So containers was a strategic decision here, right? And so whenever you're thinking about infrastructure, these are the kind of things and the kind of like arguments that you can make in these discussions to help, solidify what you're trying to do or help, your argument basically. Yeah.
Is there any argument for not using containers?
Tons. VPSs are actually still used heavily. Yeah. I have this problem myself personally because I've been in the industry for a little while now that like you're up here. You know what I mean? Like you're so used to like Kubernetes, like you're up here, but like the majority of development and stuff like that is still very much like down here. You know what I mean? And so you may be used to like Terraform and IAC and Kubernetes and cloud, blah, 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 but like, no, honestly, a lot of storefronts and things like that today are still like either running co-located even, or yeah, still running VPSs or VPSs and stuff like that, because it's this startup phase mentality of like, I just want to get it running. I don't know how to get to that point. So I know how to run commands, right? I know how to, and then they just stay. Right, and that's it, and then there you go, right? And so, no, like VPSs are actually super common still, yeah.
What is a VPS?
Oh gosh. What is it? It's a virtual private.
Well,
Well, VPC. That's VPC.
server.
VPS is server, yeah, virtual private server, basically. So in the good old days, when we didn't have, massive scaling and horizontal whatever, everybody would go to, their favorite hosting provider and pay for a little slice of compute and RAM, basically. And so we called them VPSs back in the day. That was like the marketing term that sounded cool, I guess. I don't know. I actually hated it. I was just like, just call it an instance, man. Like, I don't know. But yeah, VPSs are just, you go to a provider, I want 2 cores, 4 gigs of RAM. Cool. I'll take care of the rest, right? Yeah.
So in the context of AWS, is their VPS basically EC2 then?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's literally that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
But they renamed it to make it seem cooler.
Oh,
They call it EC2. But yeah, they're technically okay, so like for example, Rackspace, they use Amazon underneath the hood for some of their hosting, right? You're like, if you go and get a VPS at like Rackspace or some other places, it may just be an Amazon instance underneath the hood. Yeah.
What about so we talked about like EC2 or VPSs, we're talking about containers. What about and forgive me if I'm wrong,
No, you're fine.
You're right, but isn't there also other options like Elastic Beanstalk?
Yeah.
Or
Absolutely, yeah. So there's tons of options out there. Like, if you guys remember like Heroku back in the day, stuff
Yeah.
like that. I would say that like Beanstalk lands in the container world, right? Like at the end of the day, you're creating an image. I think it is. Yeah, Lambstock was container, right? Or did you also ship zips? It may have taken zips.
See, I'm not too familiar with AWS. I guess I'm thinking more like Azure App Service,
Sure.
where it's
Well, that's funny because we'll be using something like that on Amazon today.
like a .NET app to
Mhm.
without containers to an Azure App Service, and it kind of manages a lot of the
Do you ship just code to that? Like, do you just give it here's my binary?
yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you just build the solution and just use Azure DevOps CI/CD pipelines and.
Yeah, and do you know if they're using containers underneath the hood on that?
I don't think so. I think you can do containers within an app service, but you don't have to. So that's why I was wondering, is there kind of like an AWS equivalent where where it's kind of handling some of the stuff for you, and if that would be another consideration or not?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. Again, in the startup phase, I don't want to own that, right? So if you this is also where you might even actually, I'm really happy that you mentioned this. This is also when you choose if you want to go with a provider or not, right? Because if you came up to me and you said, "Hey, I can put your app on Amazon without even containers," and then this guy comes up and says, "Well, we're gonna need a container," then I'd probably be like, "Oh, well, I'm gonna take this guy," And again, that's the business mentality behind it. The tech is on you, right? But the business side of it would be well, he's got less steps to get to where I want to get. Well, then use Azure, right? And that's how companies end up making decisions like this. So yeah, absolutely. I find it interesting that you can do that, right? Because that's a closer to product delivery solution. Yeah.
Just a tech note, or just a note, folks who are in chat who don't know things about VPSs, SSH keys,
Sure.
all those kind of basics.
Sure.
You're welcome to continue to watch, but the Jem Young's front end to full stack for front end engineers course kind of covers all the basics of command line and basics of Vim and Git and security and setting up a VPS from scratch and Nginx and all these kinds of is SSL and all those kinds of things. So if those things are confusing to you, you're welcome to continue watching, but those are kind of prerequisites to this course.
Yeah. So again, just to reiterate what Mark is saying, Jem made a course in the which learning path is it again?
The full stack learning path.
Okay, so in the full stack learning path on Front End Masters, which is something you guys I would definitely recommend. Jem made a course that focuses basically on a lot of what you guys are talking about. Like, okay, I want to deploy a VPS, I want to go in with CLI, set up Docker, manage it, all that kind of stuff. That would absolutely be a good starter to this course, because then it would at least get you more comfortable with even some of these concepts and like, what is this versus this. If you don't understand what a VPS is at all, I would recommend checking out that course. It'll probably help you a bit. But these are all like there's the engineer in the room who will give suggestions, but then there's the engineer in the room that will make decisions, right? And you normally don't want to be the engineer just making suggestions. Like, if you really want to impact the company and even like grow in your career, you want to be making decisions. And so, again, like if there's two people who are like, oh, I like Azure, oh, I like Amazon. Well, it's like, okay, that's great, but what works for us, right? And so, again, just to go back off of what you said earlier, like that would be a massive argument that could be solvable by simply saying, well, Azure can get us in and on the cloud without even needing Docker knowledge, right, or anything like that. And we do take a similar approach. Again, I did take on the expectation or the responsibility of saying, well, I want it to be containerized. But again, that's also kind of a decision around, I know I'm going to be running containers in the future, right? So might as well just do it now.
Yeah, I was just getting at kind of maybe what's the trade-off.
Yep.
It seems like the VPS is the lowest level, and
Yeah.
then you got kind of the managed Azure App Service or Elastic Beanstalk,
Yep.
and then you got the containerized approach.
Yeah.
What's the trade-off there?
Normally, the managed services are containerization abstracted away, right? Normally that's what they are. Beanstalk, again, the reason why I said what I said is because I have used Beanstalk at least years ago, and from what I recall, it would take your code, bundle it up for you, and ship it out for you, right? And then they would containerize it and take care of all of it for you. But I mean, and kind of just to give a little bit more of which is better. So technically a VPS will give you more dedicated resources, right? The reason for that is it's just based off of the pure and simple fact that it's a virtual machine, right? A virtual machine takes a specific piece of compute and a specific piece of memory and says, that is mine now, thank you, I only own this, right? If you have scale, if you're really worried about I want as much compute power as possible, a VPS might be better for you. And the reason why I say that is because I don't know why Bitcoin came to mind. But that would be a good example, right? It's I know I'm going to be throttling the CPU the entire time, right? I know it's going to be consuming tons of resources. Probably don't want to put that on a container with thousands of other containers. You're going to be a bad neighbor, right? And you're going to probably make the provider mad, right? A VPS would be more helpful there. Not that I'm saying go to your cloud provider and start running Bitcoin miners. But yeah, that would, there's trade-offs there. So yeah, it's really good to think about what works best for you guys. The application that we're going to be deploying is very simple. It's just a Go application that connects to a database. We're not really worried about tons of processing power and stuff like that. And so, like I said, I knew that I wanted to be on containers in the future. So containers is kind of where we're starting. That's the first layer of the foundation of the house. It's okay, containers, great. We made one decision. Now, where do we want to run that container, right? That's the next decision. To go back to what you said as well, the nice thing about cloud providers is they normally provide some kind of managed, easy solution. They'll have an entry point solution because they want you to drink the Kool-Aid and then eventually get to the big solution, right? That's they want you on Kubernetes, but they know you can't get there, right? So they've built smaller, more again, abstracted away solutions that make it so that you can just drop your application and then 2 years later you're giving them $100,000 a year or something. And so in this case, the service I chose was AppRunner. Now, AppRunner is probably similar to Azure's, app service, where its goal is really just to be I have absolutely nothing. I just want to get my thing running in the cloud. And that's exactly what AppRunner focuses on. It will take your source code. It will potentially, or if you want it to, it'll even run its own backend builds for you. It'll containerize it, and then it'll put it up in the cloud and run it for you. What's nice about that? Well, technically, again, talking about that abstraction level, right? It's containerization, and it's using all of Amazon's existing tooling underneath the hood. That's how Amazon works. Most cloud providers do that. They'll be like, okay, well, we've already got, ECS. Well, let's build another service that's even easier on top of ECS and then charge more for it. And then there we go. Now we're making, two-handed, hands or money in both hands, basically, right? And that's what AppRunner is. AppRunner is basically a service on top of a service that makes it easier for you to get into the door. But it does mean that underneath the hood, you're going to have horizontal scalability. Like out of the box with AppRunner, you'll be able to scale to however many instances you need. Like it won't, it'll still have that, like, I don't know if you guys remember years ago, Google had a keynote where they showed off like the first like horizontal scaling Kubernetes, and like everybody was amazed and was like, oh my gosh, he's creating thousands of instances. We're at the point now where these low-level, like simple entry-level services, they do that. Like they'll do that out of the box, So there's kind of an argument here to say as well that like, you could never leave the startup phase too, right? Like you could pick a solution that works so well that you could be like, well, why do I need Kubernetes? Like it's already doing that for me. I'm already getting auto scaling. I'm already getting, automatic restarts and stuff like that. And so these do become like vendor lock-ins is really what I'm trying to say is like, at some point you'll either be running on AppRunner or you'll be running in ECS, but it's really all the same Kool-Aid. It's all the same sauce at the end of the day. It's just how much of that ownership do you want to take on? It's really my only point that I'm trying to make. So in the diagram, you'll see that our client makes a request and it goes directly to AppRunner. Now from our mentality, that's all we know. We just know it goes to AppRunner. Does that mean there's a CDN underneath it? Does that mean that there's caching? Does that mean I have no idea, right? So that's the other side of using services like this is you're putting a lot of responsibility on that one thing to solve a lot of different problems. So we have our application deployed in AppRunner. Great, awesome. However, AppRunner needs a container image, right? And so this is where we're going to start jumping into Docker. We're going to create a very simple container image, and then AppRunner will actually use Amazon storage to run that image. So we'll actually create the image, put it in Amazon's storage, and then AppRunner will use that as a reference to pull the image and run it. So now we've got two pieces, right? So we've got AppRunner, and we know that we need a container image. What about a database? Okay, so here's the fun part. I've said multiple things about Amazon. I actually really do like them as a cloud provider. They're one of my favorites. Please sponsor me, Amazon. But RDS sucks. It really does. RDS is like its own beast. And don't worry, we're still going to be working with RDS today. But I think I get this, I get this a lot where people will be like, well, should I set up my own RDS instance? Like, should I create my own database instance? Man, there's so much management that comes into managing your own database. How many here knows what a DBA is? Okay, so yeah, a few of you. A DBA is basically a database administrator that companies hire because nobody else knows what Postgres is or how to use it. Like, that's the easiest way to put it. It's like, we have this massive database with millions and millions of rows. We're going to hire somebody dedicated to that, right? And when you're at a company, that's normally what you end up doing, right? If you're in a scenario where you aren't going to do that or don't have the ability to do that, then I would make databases as less of a problem for you as humanly possible. That's my personal opinion on it. I don't like having to think about my data retention or my backups or uptime, all that stuff. So in this scenario, in this startup phase, we outsource it, right? There's a lot of really good options outside of RDS that exist out there. And there's actually options that we're going to be using today that use RDS that made a company model on top of it that then give you basically RDS, but with a few clicks of a button, and that's Supabase. I really do think that these kinds of services that kind of just say, like, here's a public endpoint with your, I know it's scary, I get it, I get it, but just having a public endpoint to start off with, like easily, like not having to deal with the networking part of it makes it easier to go to production directly. And so that's another decision as to why we chose this infrastructure the way that we did, right? Is because then I don't have to worry about like security groups or firewalls or any of this other stuff. It's just there's a connection string. They manage it. They manage the connections. They'll take care of all that stuff. Fantastic. Put it on them. So that's why we chose Supabase in this first setup. Does that mean we're going to stay on Supabase? No, because more than likely Supabase will end up costing us a lot of money. That's how they end up making their money, right? But in the early stages, especially especially if you're making no money, don't pay for a database online. You are now in the red, my friend. Lean on free services as much as you can. Like Amazon's got a free tier, Azure's got a free tier. Pretty much all of these places have free tiers now. And if you can lean on that and use it, feel free to. And so that's why we chose Supabase in this model, is to say, I don't have database knowledge, I don't know how to manage those things, so I'm gonna let another provider take care of that for me. I'm gonna throw money at the problem, but I know it'll work reliably. And I'll be real, this could save you tons of maintenance hours. Think about it, migrations running, failures, all that kind of stuff. Oh, the database is down. You don't have to worry about any of that with this approach. Yeah.
So you're hoping to save some cost by not having a database administrator, and especially when your scale is small, these costs can be small, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Where I am today, where I work, we're currently making the evaluation of moving our CI/CD. And one of the first arguments I made was, well, when do you ever worry about our CI/CD? Because we don't. It's so abstracted and something that thankfully we don't have to worry about that. Those are the kind of solutions you want to find, right? I know it's fun to play with the technology, but part of it is to make it so it works. So yeah, that's exactly it. You don't want to have to worry about hiring somebody to do it or the knowledge around it, so you can just pay them to do it, right? The last thing, and this is just kind of an additional thing, and this is something that I chose, which is I need a place to store credentials and secrets for the service, right? Now, I would assume you want some sort of security, you know what I mean? You can, if you want, say, I'm not even going to use this. I'm just going to put secrets directly in my environment variables and the security's up to you, man. However, personally, I would like some kind of secure place to put my configurations and secrets and stuff like that. And so we're using Parameter Store for this. It's a really nice tool. The reason why we're using it, if you're like, why aren't you using Vault or blah, blah, blah? Well, for starters, I don't want to deploy anything, right? That's the first thing. I don't want to have to manage that. And then the second thing is I want a UI. I don't want to manage credentials in, some kind of code base or anything like that right now. It's just easier for me to go to UI, make a couple changes, click a button, out the door it goes, right? So now we're kind of building the developer experience around it, and that's why the second part is the developer side of it. So what you'll note is that everything is basically manual, right? The user has to go to App Runner to view your page, but then if you want to change anything that the user sees or interacts with, you have to do it manually yourself, right? And so this is the other side of that startup phase, right? You normally don't have a whole bunch of automate, how many of you guys have created a project and then just done everything manually by the CLI, right? We've all done it, and that's really where you'll be in the startup phase of a company. You'll more than likely be just running commands. Somebody will be asking, because the amount of effort and requirement it takes sometimes to get to that automation is something you have to pay for, right? So yeah, that's what we're going to be building. Again, I know it was a little bit of a long-winded discussion, but I feel like now at least you understand why we chose the infrastructure that we did, right? And again, each one of these components were picked for a very specific reason to solve the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Okay, so let's start building. Well, you can actually start coding now. Cool.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What do you think of AWS Secret Manager to solve the credential management?
Yeah, so I have used Secrets Manager. I use it at my job, and I use Parameter Store mostly personally. Secrets Manager, you can kind of look at it as like a book with a ton of pages in it. And those pages can be super long and super big, or they can just be like 1 or 2 entries, right? And you just grab that document and then you get all your secrets. Awesome. That makes it really nice for like, if you have tons of secrets, to pull it in one request, right? Systems or SSM or parameter store is really meant to be value by value, right? So it's like a real key store storage. So what you would do in parameter store that you probably wouldn't do in key or secrets manager is like only have one value for like database password, right? You have a new parameter for user password versus database password, right? So that's technically that's the real difference between the two. However, it's mostly preference. They both store and encrypt the same way. They both, work effectively the same way. I tend to lean towards more like service discovery, which is where key value is more helpful than pulling down like huge, secrets manager objects and things like that. So it's really just a preference, but parameter store is meant to be more like, I just want this one value, right? I don't want the whole thing, right? That should answer the question. Cool. Any other questions before we jump in? Do we need to take a quick break before we?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Sure, yeah. Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll jump into programming.